Bioeconomy Institute in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Today, we are speaking with Professor Mahdi Al-Kaisi, a professor of agronomy and extension soil and water specialist at Iowa State University. Professor Al-Kaisi's research and extension activities center around soil management and environment, and it focuses on the effects of crop rotation, tillage systems, residue management, nitrogen input on soil carbon dynamics, soil health, greenhouse gas emissions, and crop productivity. Professor Al-Kaisi, you are a member of a committee convened by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that issued a report in late 2018 on negative emissions technologies and reliable sequestration, which seems like a very relevant topic to our own initiative in carbon removal at ISU. Can you tell us what motivated the formation of this committee and how you went about gathering information for the report?
Sure. Thanks, Robert, for the invitation to be part of this really conversation and discussion about carbon initiatives, and you're doing a great job with this format. The committee I involved in with the National Academy was formed in March 2017. And the principal objective of that committee is really as a follow-up to other committees and studies developed by NAS and in previous years on climate change. There are several studies. That committee was focused on developing research agenda to look into net zero emission technology, identify these technologies, and look into the effectiveness of these technologies and how ready to deploy for net zero emission carbon capture. So that's really the initial intent of that committee, and lasted over a year and a half. Delivered the concluding report was delivered to the National Academy of Science in October 2018. And there's about 20 institutions, government, non-government universities involved in the development of this report.
Now, I'm real curious about how you went about gathering information for this report. I mean, this is a brand new area. How'd you go about getting this information?
Yeah, the model we use as a committee, it was a very extensive process, and that involved really a robust platforms related to different portfolio of greenhouse gas emission and carbon dioxide removal. So the way we did that, basically conducting several workshops and meetings that inviting different experts nationally and internationally. So every identifiable technology we looked into and identified, we invited several experts for a week for robust discussion and presentation, and then follow up with visiting personal and individual conversation, and also some publication and sharing information through the National Academy. It was a significant amount of resources they provided to really develop this kind of a framework. And it was extensive travel. Every month we traveled to a different state to convene these different meetings and connect remotely with some international scientists for their feedback and it's kind of mini conferences, if you will, to feedback. Then the committee synthesized all this information. We have significant staff from the National Academy to put that all together. And on a quarterly basis, we review each platform, and if there's follow-up information or needs, we contact the scientists and the experts for additional feedback.
And I'm going to ask you about some specific technologies, but I want to
Sure.
make sure the audience understands the distinction between carbon reduction, which has been what we've been talking about for well over a decade, versus carbon removal, which was the real focus of this report. Could you help us understand the difference between those two?
The difference between the two, carbon reduction is mainly related to how you regulate the carbon emission from different sector in the industry and minimize the carbon emission. That's basically not involve any carbon removal and storage, which is what we call the carbon sequestration. And that's the capture of carbon through different technology. Whether we have about 6 platforms in this report we suggested or recommended based on the science and the scientists involved. And that's involved direct removal of carbon or CO2, atmospheric CO2, and secure storage. In the case of the natural resources or terrestrial carbon sequestration, and that's the distinction people they need to make between carbon sequestration and soil amendments. Carbon sequestration, it's the interaction between the plant, soil, and atmosphere. These direct capture of CO2 are from the air. And a lot of people they make also a mistake between adding amendments like organic amendments and consider that as carbon sequestration, like manure or dry manure or swine manure. That's not really a carbon sequestration. That become a source of carbon emission during the decomposition process, release CO2 back into the air. So the removal, it's the direct capture. Reduction, it's you employ technology to reduce the emission from the source to the atmosphere.
So let's get into some specifics. The report identifies 4 negative emission technologies that are, quote, ready to be deployed, but are inefficient to meet climate goals. Can you tell us about some of these specifically these 4 technologies, and what would be your personal assessment of them?
The 4 technologies first of all, we divided really based on the gathering information based on the science and the literature. There are several portfolio of net zero emission technology. One, it's ready to deploy. And these ready to deploy technologies, it's mainly could focus on the natural resources of the terrestrial ecosystem methodologies. That includes reforestation or afforestation, forest management, agriculture soil, and what they call bioenergy capture, carbon capture, or they call BEC. And that's basically these 4 principal or 4 technologies ready to deploy. And from the assessment we did as a committee, looking into the cost effectiveness, the mandate actually, or the criteria for deploying technology, 1, the effectiveness of the technology, 2, the readiness of the technology to capture CO2, and 3, the cost. So among these 3 principles, when you analyze the natural process or the 4 technologies I mentioned, which include the natural process, these the most cost effective. On average, probably cost between $50 to $80 per metric ton. When you compare it to the other technologies, which is, we call it non-mature technology, still needs some research and development understanding, and that we could talk about these other technologies as well. So these 4 technologies, and currently there's a huge push, if you follow probably what's going on in the US Congress. And the first bill was introduced in the Agriculture Committee just couple of weeks ago, and that's the climate growing action solution. And that's passed the Agriculture Committee, now is moving to the Senate for approval. That platform, basically, it's a copy of the net zero emission technology we developed to adapt into a platform for ready to deploy technology for farmers and to use in the forest, grassland, and cropland.
If I'm not mistaken, all four of those sounded like they were about growing stuff.
Right.
Even the bioenergy one, the fourth one. Is there any downside to those strategies? As let's just grow stuff and figure out how to sequester even in the soils, or I know that the bioenergy one also includes possibility of sequestering carbon dioxide. What's your personal assessment of that approach?
The limitation of that approach is it's not going to be the silver bullet or the only solution to solve the issue of carbon removal or carbon dioxide removal, because it has a limitation in the capacity of removal. The assessment from what we gather as a committee in the US, these platforms could probably remove close to 1 gigaton at best per year, and globally close to about 10 gigaton, which is about, for people not familiar with the gigaton, it's a billion metric ton of carbon dioxide. So the other downside of it is the permanency of these carbon removal and storage and the change in the land use. These, one of the issues, have some really downside. The other issue is the impact on biodiversity and also the conversion of land use into a different uses within the agriculture or the terrestrial system, and also the impact on food security. That's another concern the committee kind of articulated in the report looking into these technologies. So these are a few areas of concern. At best, probably we could achieve, even with these technology, half of what potentially could achieve 1 gigaton, half of that, or 10 gigatons globally, because we deal with very dynamic ecosystem. So you need to have all the technologies and all the platforms deployed to really make a good job and make a good dent to reach the below 2 centigrade warming potential, and that's the target by the end of the century. So you have to deploy all other technologies or other solutions beside the agriculture potential.
Well, I actually had an opportunity to speak to the committee when they were gathering information.
Right.
And I recall one committee member suggesting that the simplest solution was simply to grow trees for permanent burial, right? You dig big pits and you just bury these trees that you grow. Now, I don't think the idea made it to the final report, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. It was really in the discussion. We explore every technology, every possibility. And there is many different studies about burying, tree trunks, way below, in trenches. And basically when you bury these trees, cutting the trees and burying them, that should store the carbon, indefinitely, because you minimize the carbon losses through carbon oxidation or microbial activities if you bury deep in the soil profile. We articulated that as part of the forestry solutions, actually, and came into the report, and we included in the terrestrial chapter in the net zero emission carbon. So that's one of the solution. The other solution is the deep carbon burial of the topsoil. That some studies in Germany, they did that. And basically to invert the soil, to store the carbon, expose the subsoil to the topsoil, and that's increase the carbon sink. And basically you can maximize the carbon input. Along other technologies, which is the mineralization or direct capture, and that's other technologies. And also the coastal carbon capture, which is the wetland in around Gulf of Mexico or in around different sanctuaries, and basically to increase the carbon capture through the plant volume and the sediments. And that's basically you have not aerobic condition, you could trap significant amount of carbon there. So all these technologies, but there is a lot of research and questions need to be answered really within these technology, and they are very expensive too, especially if you deal with the mineralization and high carbon injection deep into the geological formation, and that's basically is going to be very expensive. On average, the cost we came up with as a committee close to about $180 to $200 per metric ton to do that.
Well, this conversation around burying trees did suggest there's some frustration with coming up with practical, inexpensive schemes for carbon removal. Does it make more sense to simply turn off the fossil fuel spigot and let nature run its course in drawing down carbon from the atmosphere?
Well, that's it's going to be economic and political question. How do we have the technology to replace all the fossil fuel use? That's maybe in the future, that's maybe the direction we will go. And currently, all the efforts, when we look at the climate change solution and all the other effort to move into the bioenergy, whether ethanol production from cellulosic ethanol or grain ethanol or biodiesel, and also the electricity generation, for example. That's another example. The significant amount of carbon and greenhouse gas emission, 40% come from the electricity generation. So, or the cement production. So the fossil fuel is going to be really part of the portfolio of the solution. How we want to downscale the fossil fuel use. And that's basically all the tools we have, we need to present. The question, there's no one single solution is going to solve the issue of the climate change. We need all these portfolio to look into the fossil fuel reduction use, the conversion of energy to bioenergy, and also the agriculture management opportunities and use that we need to infuse some management to reduce the fossil fuel use also. And that's where come to regenerative agriculture and other practices.
Well, let's turn to that topic. Last year, you and your colleague, Ratan Lal, wrote a paper about aligning the science and policy of regenerative agriculture. Could you define regenerative agriculture for our audience and explain how it relates to carbon removal?
Regenerative agriculture is really not a new concept. It has been explored, and particularly when you look at the non-developed countries and you look at the low input practices, it's semi-closed system, minimize the energy input and reduce the waste. And that's basically what they call the agronomy input loss. And so when you reduce the agronomy input, which is include chemical fertilizer, pesticides, chemicals, fossil fuel, then you go into what we call regenerative agriculture. And basically you increase the output with minimizing the input. And that has economic and social uh, um, really elements, and to protect the soil, restore the soil. The principle of regenerative agriculture, or the core benefits of it, it's the restoration of the soil, increasing the soil health, protection of the water resources, and that's practices. These practices, it's individually and collectively practiced by farmers around the world. And most notably, if we look here in our agricultural production system using, for example, no-till, or using residue management, or using cover crop, these practices enhance the soil biodiversity, enhance the soil productivity, and reduce the input. In our studies, long-term studies, tillage and crop rotation studies for the past 20 years, farmer could benefit from saving approximately $30 per acre on input by using no-till system over time. So there is a lot of it. So regenerative agriculture, it's a big umbrella, include organic farming, include many different practices that minimize, in the nutshell, the input in the farming practices.
So in other words, regenerative agriculture is not only going to be good for agriculture, but good for the environment in terms of if we can actually use it to help remove carbon from the atmosphere. Now, in your paper, though, you talk about climate change can exacerbate soil degradation. Could you explain that connection?
Definitely. When we look at the climate change and the extreme weather events, driven by the climate change, I look at the drought, a good example just in Iowa last summer, when we have high wind and drought destroy significant amount of crops and reduce productivity. And also another example hit home, which is basically in 2012, we have significant drought. And we publish a paper on the impact of that drought during that time, reduce the destruction and reduction in a crop close to about 40% in our estimates when we look at the studies. The other issues with the climate change, when you look at the hot area becoming hotter, wet area becoming wetter, and basically these extreme events, it's gonna decrease the productivity. When you decrease the productivity, basically you decrease that carbon input or any residue input in the soil system, and that's going to compromise the soil biodiversity. And if you don't have a good cover crop, people, they couldn't grow anything. Mm-hmm. And basically, globally, here in Iowa, we are blessed with good soil, good weather condition. But when you look at other arid and semi-arid areas, there is significant impact on soil degradation because of the climate change. But employing some practices that mitigate that change, mm-hmm. and mitigate these extreme events, that's going to restore some, soil health, restore the biodiversity, and sustain food productivity. And that's essential to food security, if you will, globally.
Well, as I shared with you before we got on air, I've got a whole list of questions I want to ask you, but I promised Ali that I would let the audience ask some. So I'm going to let them start asking. When they stop asking, I'm going to start talking again. So Ali, can you help us with a question?
Yes. So the first one is more of just kind of expanding on your knowledge. And that is, can you please expand on the reduction of food security statement, and how will food security production, I assume, be impacted by the adoption of these new strategies, kind of forecasting on your expertise?
when we look at the changes, in the soil environment, or you look at the changes because of the climate change and the extreme events, that definitely is going to impact the food security. And food security, basically, it's related to the productivity of the soil. So soil security is equal food security. If we restore the soil to a level of productivity by enhancing the biodiversity, we will maximize the productivity per unit. And that's essential if we want to face the deployment of these practices, whether we use no-till or use cover crop or we use other amendments to improve soil health, that will increase the productivity of the soil. And definitely that will enhance the food security, in a sense, increase the productivity. And when you look at it globally, there is a lot of need in that. So when we restore the soil biodiversity in different parts of the world, employ these kind of technologies, cover crop or no-till or amendment or diverse crop rotation. There's a lot of studies in Iowa states and about the minimum input and maximize the output because of the recycling of nutrients, improving the soil health, and increase the soil biodiversity. That definitely is going to reflect on the economic saving and also increase the food quality and quantity.
Very good. I've noticed in the chat that they have a link to your report. So as an engineer, I found it very readable. So I encourage people to click on that and find some more about this report. So I'm an engineer, and I'm fascinated by the notion of direct air capture, using these gigantic machines run on cheap energy to suck 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Actually, I had my students calculate how much energy it took to suck out 410 parts per million. It's a little sobering,
Right.
and I'm going to say I don't necessarily endorse this approach, but I would be interested in your perspective on whether the so-called biological versus engineering approaches to carbon removal are most likely to be deployed at scale.
There is really significant debate about this approach as related to the engineering approach and the direct capture. And basically, you are familiar with that, Robert, and that giant sucking machines suck the CO2, processed through sodium hydroxide and convert it into, basically through chemical process, goes in producing what we call calcium carbonate, and that could be an agricultural product as a lime, for example. And that process requires significant amount of energy. And as I told you, 1 ton of CO2 sucked into this process, and the average cost close to about $180 to $200 per ton. That's cost prohibitive to even envision that technology applicable. So that's my personal view. That's where the tendency was focused on the ready technology, and the natural resources is more effective and in capturing the carbon through the biomass of production, yet also the challenge how you secure that the permanency, that's the downside. But when you look at the cost, is fraction if what you use the engineering methodology. Sure, you could use these byproducts to produce other products, to use this in building and other uses in infrastructure. But the initial cost is very costly, and that's where the ready technology we recommended that could be more effective in the short term, but in the long term, you need to consider all the platforms or portfolio into net zero emission.
Well, I've seen some evidence that companies that are in these very carbon intensive industries are starting to make some serious moves on what are we going to do in the next 20 years
Right.
to change our business model, to do things a little bit differently. I'd like you to put your extension specialist hat on for a moment and offer some thoughts on engaging farmers in carbon removal.
Right. When we look into the current effort about carbon removal, it's and I'm engaged with a lot of different other entities and working on different groups, providing some input and my expertise from my research and about these issues. It's becoming promising, the current emphasis on the carbon credit on the agriculture. And that's kind of encouraging because there's a lot of drive and momentum to maximize the use of agricultural practices and agriculture systems in capturing carbon. And what the farmers are doing currently, employing these different practices, they deserve to be paid for that. And that's basically, but the challenge is we don't have really a national standard to look into how we're going to capture this momentum currently to benefit the farmers, to benefit agriculture. So in the current actually discussion about the upcoming farm bill, there's significant discussion how we frame rethink the farm bill to address these issues. For example, a creation of the carbon bank. That's an idea is kind of entertained. The creation of the Climate Conservation Corps. That's another idea. Also to look into how we engage farmers in the development of carbon credit market. Currently, it's the Wild West. It's a gold rush. Every entity trying to create a shop for carbon credit, and there is no real serious, thinking about several aspects of the carbon credit issues. One is the monitoring, measuring, verification, and certification. These need to be standardized. And that's with the current actually Senate bill, that's what they're trying to do, to give farmers more actually weight into the process. And what farmer gets through these different entities currently, probably they get 10% of what they offer when they buy these credits. 30 to 40% goes to the middleman. So these are without any national standard. Really, this is economically is not going to work good for the farmers. So basically, I think in the upcoming year or two is going to be significant improvement, in my opinion, in the development of the carbon credit, because the climate change is going to be here with us, and we need to think about seriously and build a solid foundation for the carbon credit market. And that's based on science and based on clear principle and standardized, uniform principles and standards, how we monitor these carbon credits, how we measure it, how we verify these changes, how the land use is going to impact these carbon credits. So there's a lot of questions, and there's significant amount of work currently is going on. So my really recommendation to the farmers, and I have a lot of calls and meetings about this, take your time, be careful before you sign on anything. Read the fine print, and have a good lawyer there, because there is an issue of the data ownership too. So we need to think about that. Who owns the data when you monitor these carbon credits? How you buffer the change, how you count for the buffer and the carbon change. If some farmer change of practices, they need to understand when they locked into contract, they're gonna have to stay with it. And there's penalties on that contract. So a person needs to do their homework before signing any piece of paper.
Sounds like good advice. Ali,
Robert?
you have something? Yes.
Yeah, I did want to kind of get some of, we have just a few more minutes. So let's get some of our participants' questions. For ISU students, this might hopefully be kind of a quicker question. What are some of the classes and topics that they could like learn more about this? So basically wanting to learn more about these topics, what classes could they take?
Well, there is a lot of classes related to agricultural production, whether in the agronomy department or ag and biosystem engineering departments. When you look at the crop production, you look at the soil science courses, whether soil chemistry, soil fertility, soil management, and there is crop production, crop physiology. Because really, when you look at the carbon issues, it's a multidisciplinary approach, and you need to arm yourself with these different knowledge bases to be equipped really to answer these questions and to be effective in developing a good career, direction as students to go in these different areas. Because these environmental areas, it's a multidisciplinary areas. I named a few, I maybe missed a few other courses that's essential for our students really to look at this principle of agricultural production practices, soil science, soil chemistry, soil physics, and all these different courses that, soil ecology. These courses will be critical to improve our understanding how we develop a good management skills.
Wonderful. Another really, I think, critical question to talk about when it comes to research and extension. What's the biggest data gap in terms of Iowa agriculture systems' ability to remove carbon?
Well, the bigger data gap, from what we have, it's really we need to develop a long-term studies, and that's critical to answer these questions. So when we look at whether climate data, or you look at the soil data or crop production data, all these different data relevant, and we need to really rethink our approach to research within our extension and research. And that's basically, we need to have a multidiscipline involvement in these projects and not one singular approach. I'm a soil scientist, I'll focus on one area of my work. So when we develop that multidiscipline approach, that's how we serve our farmers better. Put the economic layers on it, and put the crop production layer, the soil science layer, all these different layers of information is going to be significantly critical to develop that information to inform the farmer decision or to inform agriculture, rethink our agricultural production.
Great. So we had a couple of really good questions come in, but I think this one's really important and pretty on topic. Could ISU develop a decision maker spreadsheets to help elevate several of these carbon pricing strategies to the farmer?
I think that's a critical issue. We need to be more, probably involved in that endeavor to develop that. There is some attempt, whether within the agriculture economics specialist, to look into that data, gathering information, and also to look at data web-based, maybe calculation information for carbon credit, carbon calculation. That's a great idea. I think this is a critical things we need to do. I think we need to look into the carbon issue more seriously within Iowa State as an institution, to look at it beyond just, and that's what I was discussing with Robert initially. We need to look into that. We have the water centers currently at Iowa State. That's established in 1987 across the country. Why don't we have carbon centers across the land-grant universities to look into that and build a momentum to serve the farmers and become a clearinghouse for all the information that the farmers need and provide a good science-based information?
I think that's a great way to wrap up our talk. I've got 3 takeaways I just want to amplify. Farmers need to be careful and take their time in making decisions about carbon trading, et cetera. We need more long-term multidisciplinary studies. And finally, we need decision-making tools for farmers to be able to decide how they could best move forward. So with that, Mahdi, I really appreciate your time you've taken today to talk to us. Thank you very much. I am going to share my screen for some wrap-up.
Thank you.
What's next?
Thanks, Robert, for having me.
Thank you. Right. Okay, let's see what's next. May 19th, Dr. Chad Hart will be joining us. He's a professor and crop markets extension specialist in economics here at Iowa State University. His talk will be on Let's Talk About Carbon Markets. So this will be real interesting to see the economic side of this discussion. On June 2nd, Dr. Frank Mitloder, who is a professor and air quality extension specialist in animal science, and he's also the director of the CLEAR Center at the University of California, Davis, will be speaking to us. His talk is A Path to Climate Neutrality and Livestock Production. I should say our discussion with him is on this topic. So we hope you can join us for those. We want to hear from you. Do you have some ideas for our conversations about carbon? Furthermore, we'd like to hear if you have ideas for research, education, and outreach on carbon capture. We heard some today. We'd like to hear from you. So please contact us at alik@iastate.edu, and we'll start a conversation with you. So with that, I think that's all of our time. I appreciate all the folks that have joined us today. Hope we'll see you in the future. Thank you.